It is game day on Gamecock Central Radio. Welcome in, everybody. Emerson Phillips with Wes Mitchell previewing this Kentucky game that is set for a 7:30 kickoff on the SEC Network. Road game for the Gamecocks tonight. And, Wes, I'll tell you what, this is a very intriguing matchup in my estimation because the Gamecocks just thumped Vanderbilt, and Kentucky is off to the best start that it's had in 40 years.
Yeah, it's become a really, really big game, obviously, all of a sudden for both teams. And Kentucky riding high right now, a home game sold out, a night game. For all the talk about Kentucky being a basketball school, which obviously they are, one of the things that stood out to me the most, Emerson, was the atmosphere they had last week in that Mississippi State game. I mean, that was a big-time, major college football atmosphere, and the crowd fed off the team, and the team fed off the crowd. It sort of works hand in hand. So, you don't really think about it, as Kentucky being like one of your major teams in college football offhand, but I think this is a really good Kentucky football team, and South Carolina's going to have to honestly deal with a great atmosphere because right now Kentucky fans are clearly riding high.
Yes, they are, and for good reason, Wes. Kentucky comes in 4-0, wins over Central Michigan, at Florida, Murray State, and Mississippi State. Last week, Mississippi State was ranked 14th in the country. So we talked earlier this week with Justin Roland from CatsIllustrated.com, who will sit in with us for a moment later in the Game Day podcast today. And, he talked about the fact that the Kentucky offense obviously wants to run the football. 28-7, they beat Mississippi State, and they fell behind 7-0 in that game, so their defense shut Mississippi State out in the second half, and that was obviously a big win for Kentucky. That game played in the rain, but what really got this season going for them, Wes, was that win at Florida in the second week of the season. We know that Kentucky had not beaten Florida in 30 years, and they went down to the Swamp and beat Florida with a big second half. So, talk about Kentucky to this point. 1977 was the last time Kentucky was 4-0 overall and 2-0 in the SEC, and they're tied with Georgia for first in the East right now.
Yeah, I think like I said earlier, their fans are sky high right now. I'm sure that the team is as well. I think one of the biggest questions on that side is, are they prepared to handle the moment? I think at times, if you're looking at it from a South Carolina perspective, the Gamecocks have gone into some big games. They have been riding high, and when the moment is too big for you, then you sort of lose a little bit of your attention to detail. You make mistakes you're not used to making. You try to do too much as opposed to doing what you've always done. So I'm very, very curious to see how this Kentucky team responds to the added attention that they're getting right now because it is just a little bit different. And to me, the teams that are used to playing in these big games generally fare better because they're just more comfortable. So that's a big question for me. Like you said, they do have at least a couple of big wins, winning at Florida, then beating Mississippi State. They were nearly a 10-point underdog going into that game last week at home, and they were really able to put Mississippi State away late. I think that game was much closer throughout the ball game than the final score indicates. It really, Emerson, was a bit of a defensive battle for most of the game.
Yep.
Kentucky was almost shut out in the first half. They got a late score that really, I think, gave them some momentum going into the second half. Then they got some big defensive plays with turnovers that put their offense into good position. And then Benny Snell, really sort of salted the game away with some late scores as well. So it was a closer game than the score indicates. But, Snell, to me, is a bit of a throwback running back in that these days everybody rotates. Everybody has two or three guys, and certainly Kentucky has some other guys that are pretty good too that they rotate in, but this kid's a true workhorse back. He's averaging over 20 carries per game. So, he's a guy they're going to get the football early and often, and he's one of those guys that it appears he gets better as the game goes on because he's able to sort of, I think, wear away at defenses going into the third and fourth quarters.
Yeah, Benny Snell, 25 carries, 165 yards, and 4 touchdowns in that Kentucky win over Mississippi State last Saturday. And, Wes, Kentucky and Mississippi State had to be separated before kickoff. The two teams, had exchanged some words, and there was a little small physical altercation. And it seems like Kentucky football's got a bit of an edge to it right now that maybe it has lacked in years past.
Yeah, they do, and I think ultimately you want your team to sort of take on the personality of its coach, and I think Mark Stoops is a fiery guy. He's a defensive-minded coach. Really probably tries to instill a lot of the same just pillar philosophies to his program that Will Muschamp does here in South Carolina. So, I think you look at him and you're seeing that. You're seeing a long process of recruiting and building sort of paying off now. It hasn't really been a quick fix, but you're seeing, I think, Muschamp talked about it this week, much better team speed on defense. They're just simply more talented overall than they have been. They've got some veteran guys, and they have some NFL guys too. It's not just that they have guys who've been in the system for a long time. They have guys that are going to be, potential NFL draft picks. And, I think you look up and down their defense and you see size, you see speed, and, the kid, Josh Allen, the edge rusher, I think has quickly become one of the better pass rushers in this conference. And when Mississippi State put themselves in a position where he was able to just pin his ears back and get after the quarterback, their tackles were not quick enough to block him out on the edge. So, I think when you go into these games, it's just as much about keeping yourself out of bad situations as anything, obviously depending on the matchup. But when you look at Kentucky, you've got to stay out of those third and long situations where you're just allowing their guys to pin back their ears and rush the passer and not worry about the running game. And, I think Mississippi State was in a bad spot on the other side as well, because Kentucky wants to just run the football. So if they have a lead on you, then they're really not – you're not forcing their quarterback to go have to beat you. They're just going to continue to pound away with the football in the running game. So to me, Mississippi State put itself in a bad situation on both sides of the ball, and it just really played into Kentucky's favor.
Yeah, it did. All right, we're going to talk about improved Kentucky defense. Kentucky's defense playing a lot better this year, and I think they really look athletic. And Muschamp talked about the fact that their team speed is improved, and Wes just talked about that. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail here about the Kentucky defense later, and we're going to talk about the point spread this week. Very interesting the way the point spread has moved back and forth throughout the course of the week. And that's not normally something we get into very in-depth, but we are going to talk about that a little bit on the Game Day podcast here today. But Wes, let's start in analyzing this game or breaking down this game. You got to start with what you just said a moment ago. Kentucky wants to run the football. They've got the top rushing attack in the Southeastern Conference. And, Wes, I go back to that Georgia game expressing my concerns for the Gamecocks. Georgia ran for 220 in the third quarter, and now the Gamecocks have to face a Kentucky team that is the top rushing attack in the SEC. Is Kentucky's offensive line going to be as big as Georgia's, Wes?
No, I think they're a really good offensive line, certainly, but are they going to be quite as big or talented as Georgia? No, I don't think so. And I think a lot of that Georgia game, how does it play out like that? I think you got to factor in the ability that Georgia had on the edge at wide receiver as well. And people may be saying, well, what does that have to do with the running game? Well, you're able to continue to open up space in the running game by continuing to have that threat on the outside. And I thought Georgia did a great job of sort of yo-yoing South Carolina's defense, so to speak, back and forth between putting it outside on the perimeter. Then you try to take that away, and they run the ball back inside. You bring an extra defender inside, and they flip the ball out to their fast receivers outside. So I thought that Georgia's overall team speed on offense was the difference in that game. And I look at Kentucky's quarterback situation, and that's my biggest question mark with this team. Terry Wilson has done a good job of managing what they do on offense, and he's a good runner, but he's not shown so far that he can be a consistent passer. And I think if you're South Carolina, that's the key. We talk about Benny Snell and slowing him down, and that being the key to it. In the case of Georgia, they would still have a guy like Jake Fromm to fall back on. In the case of Kentucky, there's that's a question mark for them. If Terry Wilson, their quarterback, is forced to go win a football game, is he able to go do that? I think if you're South Carolina, you want to force him to answer that question this week, because if you do that, your chances of winning they go way up. And I think we got to remember every football game is different, and how the game plays out affects the type of decisions you have to make throughout the game. So, Georgia was never really put in any position to be uncomfortable in that football game. They were able to just run their basic offense and not put the ball in danger at all, not potentially turn the ball over. You look at Kentucky against Mississippi State, as that game went on, that there was no reason to do anything that was going to risk the football as that game wore on. You just keep feeding your workhorse back. If you're South Carolina, you need to come out like you did against Vanderbilt and force Kentucky to try to play keep up, because in the first half of the Mississippi State-Kentucky game, they're just trading punts and a missed field goal here, but for the most part, you were never really forced. If you're Kentucky, you were never really forced to go score to keep up. So you could kind of stay conservative. So I think that's a big key when you look at this Kentucky offense. We know the Kentucky defense is pretty good, and we know that Benny Snell is good on offense, but how good is this Kentucky offense top to bottom, especially if you force them to go past the football?
Yep, that's something the Gamecocks endeavor to find out tonight. Georgia clearly a much more balanced offense and in a much better position to throw the football when they needed to. So that's the real question coming into tonight for Kentucky. Terry Wilson is a fantastic athlete. He's a great runner. He's very quick. He's elusive. He's shifty. But can he beat the Gamecocks from the pocket if Carolina is able to find a way to keep contain on him? Can Terry Wilson win that ball game with his arm? So, I don't know that we know enough about Terry Wilson at this point to know. I don't think Kentucky people know about Terry Wilson enough at this point to have a definitive answer to that question. He only threw 14 passes in the Mississippi State game, Wes, and he was 8 of 14 for 81 yards, and obviously that game was played in a steady rain, so I think that was a factor in the play calling as well, and that may have actually played into Kentucky's hands a little bit in terms of their ability to run the football. But obviously that's got to be the game plan for South Carolina, West. You find a way to slow down Benny Snell. You know he's going to get his. You're not going to completely shut him down, but you contain his productivity, slow him down a little bit, and then find out what Terry Wilson can do.
Yeah, and I was looking through Pro Football Focus, which we actually have access to on Rivals now, Emerson. And I don't know if you've ever read some of their stuff, but it goes into such detail about various scenarios with a particular player, and you can break it down with quarterbacks to plays when they were under pressure, plays when there was no pressure, plays when they were not blitzed, plays when they were blitzed. And something really stood out to me is that when there's no pressure on Terry Wilson, he has a passer grade, which is this is their own grading system, so this isn't like quarterback rating or anything like that, but he has a passer rating or passer grade of 73.9, which is in the green and is considered to be a good but not great grade. Now, if you go down to under pressure, his grade drops all the way from 73.9 to 29.3, which is completely in the red, way, way, way below average of a grade. And also his carrier rating, which is basically determined by how many times do you fumble or not, goes all the way down to a 28 as well. So when he's been under pressure, he's been in trouble. You take it a step further, when he's not blitzed, his pass rating is or grade is 66.5, which obviously still is not great, but is considered to be above average, basically. When he is blitzed, and this is where it really got interesting for me, it drops all the way to 40.7, but his run grade shoots all the way up to 89.1, which means that when teams have blitzed him and have missed, that's led to him being able to break out for big plays in the running game. So if you just look at the numbers there, and what that breakdown tells me is that, it's a universal truth in football. You have to get pressure on the opposing quarterback. But in this case, the drop-off is just huge. And B, if you're going to send a blitzer, especially if you're going to send some of the all-out blitzes, you better stay in your lanes. You have to stay, keep him contained as opposed to just rushing freely, because if you miss, that's when you open up the chance for a quarterback to take off and have some big plays, and that's clearly happened with him.
So blitz at your own risk against Terry Wilson and this Kentucky Wildcats offense. Wes, I heard Chris Clark on the radio this week talking about the fact that Carolina put Javon Kinlaw in some good positions just from a schematic standpoint to get one-on-one matchups in that game against Vanderbilt last week. And Kinlaw, obviously co-defensive lineman of the week in the SEC, had a big game, couple sacks and tackles for loss, and he forced turnovers. He did everything last Saturday for South Carolina. So how will the Gamecocks go about trying to do that again and get a repeat performance from Javon Kinlaw?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question probably somewhat relies on Javon Kinlaw's teammates. I was looking when I rewatched the game, and Kentucky's interior guys, especially their center, just absolutely could not with Javon Kinlaw's quickness, in my opinion. You look at Kinlaw and his size and just the sheer physical ability there, and you might think of him as far as strength, but to me, it was his quickness that Vanderbilt's offensive lineman on the interior could not deal with. So how does Kentucky then decide they want to handle that? Do they bring an extra defender and sort of try to double him inside? Possibly so. If they do that, then it all of a sudden it becomes on, Keir Thomas, on Kobe Smith, on, Bryson Allen Williams out there on the edge. They then have to sort of force Kentucky out of that and make them hurt. I thought that Keir Thomas and Bryson Allen Williams actually played, their better games of the year so far as well. So I think that was a big part to getting Kinlaw free, is that his teammates were playing pretty well too. So I think if you're looking for one of those game within a game things to focus on while you're watching the game tonight, and I know there are so many different things you can watch, it's hard to watch everything, but if you're watching big number 3 in the middle, start looking. Does Kentucky put 2 guys on him? Do they sort of use one guy to chip him before they send him to the next level in the running game? Or are you watching number 3 just have to deal with one guy? If he's having to deal with one guy, then I don't think you can ever predict a defensive tackle to have back-to-back games like he had last week. That was just, you don't see defensive tackles put up those type of numbers across the board. But if it's one-on-one, then I think you're going to see Javon Kinlaw have another impactful game. And I think even Javon, I don't want to say he was surprised by what he was able to do, but I'll be curious to see what a game like that can do for someone's confidence, because let's be honest, Javon Kinlaw came in here as an outstanding athlete who was very raw as a football player. He was still learning the game. He's still learning the position. He's still learning what it takes to be really, really good. So it may have opened his eyes a bit just to see, okay, I am capable of dominating a football game.
The SEC is a line of scrimmage league. We say it every week, and last week Javon Kinlaw helped the Gamecocks really dominate the line of scrimmage against Vanderbilt. It'll be interesting to see what Kentucky does to try to keep him off step a little bit tonight in the 7:30 kickoff on the SEC network. Gamecocks and Wildcats. Kentucky ranked 17th in the country. They're 4-0 and 2-0 in the SEC. Gamecocks coming in 2-1 overall and 1-1 in the league. So, from a defensive standpoint for the Gamecocks, Wes, Kinlaw will try to help Carolina control the line of scrimmage again. I think tackling will be at a premium tonight. If you let Benny Snell break tackles, he's going to kill you. And I think good tackling will have to come not just from the front 7. T.J. Brunson obviously will be a key player tonight from that middle linebacker spot for the Gamecocks. But I think corners and safeties are going to have to defend the run tonight, Wes. There's no doubt about it. Tackling will be at a premium, and the guys on the back end of the defense are going to have to contribute also.
Yeah, I think if you're going to slow a great back, to your point, it falls on everybody, all 11 guys. It's always been interesting to me if you sort of slow down a big running play and watch it on replay in slow motion, and how just being spot or being blocked out of their lane leads when you have now if you have an average back or an average team, then maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe 2 or 3 guys can make a mistake, but then everybody else sort of picks it up and makes the play. But when you have a great back like this, it changes the game a bit. And I think all 11 guys have to really execute to get them off the field. So I think that's a great point. Not just your backers, not just your defensive line, but your defensive backs too. All 11 are going to have to play well when you're facing a back like Benny Snell. And it seems sort of obvious, but just getting off the field early in drives, at least for part of the time, and not allowing this guy to just wear away at you, to me, has to be a key. You're always happy when you can force a punt, but I think forcing a 3-and-out or 2 early in the game and not letting Kentucky just sort of wear away at your defense could be another key.
On the other side of the football, Wes, let's talk about the Gamecock offense versus the Kentucky defense. Carolina ran for 273 against Vanderbilt and really dominated up front in a way that I was not expecting to see. So that was a pleasant surprise last Saturday. Carolina just whipped Vanderbilt really from start to finish. But the Kentucky defense will be a different proposition tonight. And Muschamp talked about Jordan Jones and Josh Allen, and you talked a little bit about those two at the start of the podcast today. Kentucky's defense is athletic, and it's a product of the recruiting efforts and improvements that Stoops has made in the time that he's been there.
Yeah, it really is. You look, like you said, Josh Allen, this kid is, I think, a future top-round draft pick. He gets off the edge. They really use him. They line him up way out wide, especially when you get in passing situations. That sort of wide 9 concept where you get your defensive end out just as far as possible and let him use his speed off the edge, makes things difficult for your tackles. So that'll be a key matchup for South Carolina to watch. And then, on top of everything else, they have size at their cornerback positions. I think Stoops has a similar approach to Will Muschamp and Javaris Robinson and what he looks for, what he recruits in his defensive backs. All of their cornerbacks have length, and that I can remember that just simply not always being the case, with Kentucky, is that even when they had solid defensive backs, I don't think they had the size that they do now. So, these are guys that can match up and use their length to hurt you, both in one-on-one situations in the pass game, which we know South Carolina is going to try to get their receivers into. And, generally those guys will be a little bit better at defending the run and defending the screen and stuff like that. So this is a little bit different defense than South Carolina faces most weeks. It seems to me that a lot of SEC teams play a lot of man coverage. Jake Bentley said that Kentucky will show you more zone, which means that, it's going to be all eyes. You're not turning and running like you are in man coverage. All eyes are on the football. All 11 will be tracking to the football, and it creates a little bit more or a little bit different of a game plan than maybe you saw last week. Last week, it was sort of run the football and then attack deep on the edges against Vanderbilt. Against Kentucky, you may have to see more intermediate type routes, more comebacks on the outside, as opposed to just attacking like we saw last week.
All right, Kentucky's defense, second in the conference in total defense. And, one of the concerns for Kentucky, after talking with Justin Roland from CatsIllustrated.com this week, he said that, in terms of quarterback and wide receivers, South Carolina is easily the best team that the Wildcats will have faced this year. They have not faced as dynamic a group as they will see tonight with the Gamecocks.
Yeah, and I think Shai Smith is the one that really makes that group as dangerous as they are. It's obviously everybody knows about Deebo Samuel, everybody knows about Brian Edwards, but when you add a guy into the slot that can also hurt you, it makes it difficult on you to play any type of man coverage. And I think Vanderbilt was really, really exposed a bit as far as that goes, because they play a defense where they played a lot of man coverage, and they had a lot of guys. They had an extra guy in the box, and so you're talking about asking one safety to help out, and when you stretch the defense, that safety can't play both sides of the field at the same time. Traditionally, we think of slot receivers sort of operating underneath and on quick little short routes, but South Carolina likes to use Shai Smith to also expand the field and get deep, and they love that slot fade to him. Similar, they hit him on 2 plays against Vanderbilt. very similar concept to, and maybe even the same exact play to what they hit in the Outback Bowl against Michigan for a touchdown. I think they hit him against Florida maybe on that play last year. So these guys are tough to cover, and it'll be interesting to see if Kentucky does decide to play a lot of zone and how that really affects South Carolina's play calling and decision making in the passing game. But this is an RPO-based offense a lot of times, and Will Muschamp, from a defensive standpoint, talked all off season about how it's very difficult to play zone coverage against the RPO because it makes you wrong every time. So, from that standpoint, this could be a very RPO-heavy game for South Carolina's offense. And if they can force Kentucky to play a lot of man coverage, then that should be a fun matchup, seeing Carolina's receivers against those big Kentucky DBs.
Yep. Wes, we're only 3 games into the season for South Carolina, but coming off this Vanderbilt game, I wanted to get you to assess Brian McClendon as a play caller. I think South Carolina obviously benefited from the fact that they were able to control the line of scrimmage against Vanderbilt, but play calling looked very effective to me for South Carolina. Were it not for a couple of mistakes, Carolina could have easily put 50 on the Commodores last Saturday.
Absolutely, 50 or even more. I think it was right there for the taking. And, whenever South Carolina is able to run the football like they did against Vandy, that's going to be the ceiling for this offense is going to be very high. Like whenever they're able to establish that, then everything else is sort of just going to click into place. If they're not able to run the football, then it makes it easy. It makes it more difficult to throw it around, and those two things really just work hand in hand, as Jake Bentley talked about this week. So I think every week that's going to be something we talk about. If South Carolina establishes the run, then all of a sudden it gives them the ability to get these big explosive plays that we've talked about. And that's the key right now to their offense is big explosive plays, and that's their goal, to have a bunch of those. They had 15 of them against Coastal Carolina. I think 13 of them last week, a bunch of them in the run game against Vanderbilt. Georgia, I'm trying to think, I think they had like 6 explosives. So that's definitely well short of what their goal is each week, and that'll be another thing to watch this week is those explosive plays, which South Carolina defines as a run of 10 or a throw of 15 or more.
All right, 7:30 kickoff tonight for the Gamecocks and the Wildcats. Gamecock Central's Game Day podcast here. Emerson Phillips with Wes Mitchell. We're going to hear from Collin Taylor in a few minutes, and we're also going to hear from Justin Roland from CatsIllustrated.com. Get a look at the Kentucky perspective heading into tonight's matchup. So Kentucky's ranked 17th in the country. And, Wes, one aspect of this game that we have not yet discussed, and we probably shouldn't have waited until this late in the podcast to do it, is the fact that Kentucky has won 4 straight in this series. It was not that long ago that it was virtually inconceivable that Kentucky would beat South Carolina 4 years running in football. But that's where we are, Wes.
We are here. It is a fact. And I know South Carolina fans hate the thought, but it happened. And now I think it's been interesting, Emerson, that South Carolina has taken a different approach this year. I think last year I pretty distinctly remember the players talking openly about the streak and about what it meant to them and how big this game was for them. Then I think you listen to the players this year, and it's they go back to that motto every week is a season that they've talked about all season long so far. They've doubled down on that. None of the players are admitting that this game possibly means any more than any other game, and I think that's the right approach because Brian Edwards said it. Whenever you start focusing on those type of things, that removes your focus a little bit from just executing and doing what you know how to do. So I think this team has a veteran approach to the game, and we'll see if it matters this week because the other thing to remember is, yes, that streak, the idea of that streak sucks for Carolina fans to hear, frankly, because of what Kentucky is. And South Carolina fans and media as well, we're always going to think of South Carolina football as being above Kentucky football. But the other thing to remember is that this Kentucky football team is actually really good. So, if Kentucky goes and beats South Carolina tonight, it doesn't have anything to do with the streak. It just means that Kentucky's pretty dang good this year.
Yeah, they are. 4-0, 2-0 in the SEC. First time that they have been both of those since 1977. So it's really shaping up to be an historic year for the Kentucky Wildcats. I'm curious to know how much the Gamecocks may have talked internally about this 4-game losing streak. You know, we talked about last week's game. Carolina had beaten Vanderbilt 9 straight, and Derek Mason said that they didn't really talk about that. That's not really something they got into, and I just feel like, you know, that probably should be something you talk about if somebody's really got your number like that. And 4 years in a row is not the same as 9, but clearly there's a trend developing here, Wes, and the Gamecocks want to go up to Lexington and break that trend tonight. So I think this is an important game for South Carolina just because Kentucky has become a thorn in the side of Gamecock football. I mean, I heard folks on the radio in Columbia talking about Kentucky, you know, back in July. Gamecock fans are tired of losing to Kentucky. They expect to beat Kentucky, and that doesn't change the fact that this may be the best Kentucky team ever. I think that's a possibility. You know, they won at Florida. No Kentucky team had done that in 30 years. So we've already seen some evidence that this Kentucky team is better than any they've had in the last 30 years. But that doesn't change the fact that the Gamecock fans expect to beat Kentucky. And I think this is a huge ball game for South Carolina tonight from that standpoint alone.
Yeah, and, you know, we talked about it last week with these two games sort of lumped together, Vanderbilt and Kentucky. And, you know, this probably wasn't a stretch of the season that was necessarily circled prior to the year by the fan base. You know, everybody obviously wanted to talk about Georgia, and, you know, you look ahead to big games with teams like Texas A&M and stuff like that, and those are fun and all, but if South Carolina is going to have the season that we all talked about being a possibility prior to the year, it needed a win last week, which it got, and it probably needs a win this week too. So, you know, I think it's going to be tough for Georgia to lose enough games to get South Carolina back into the SEC East race. But you know what? Crazier things have happened. We tend to take one football game and give it way too much importance as far as what we think a team is. So could Georgia go through a rough patch, and next thing you know, South Carolina's back in the conversation in the East? Crazier things have happened. So I think with that said, this game, though, has to be a win for us to ever even possibly have that conversation.
All right, Wes, before we get to our keys to victory today for both teams, I wanted to talk about the point spread a little bit this week. And, you know, again, this is not something we typically get into, but the point spread movement this week has been very interesting to me. South Carolina opened as a slight favorite. I think it was 1.5 or 2 points the Gamecocks were favored by. And we even posted an article on Gamecock Central this week about the fact that the Gamecocks opened as a surprise favorite on the road at Kentucky, despite the fact Kentucky had won 4 in a row in the series, and Kentucky had just beaten the 14th-ranked team in the country to go to 4-0 and 2-0 in the league for the first time since '77. So all those things combined made it a bit of a surprise to me that South Carolina was favored. So what happened over the course of just a few days is that, you know, a lot of action on Kentucky moved that line, and Kentucky was favored by 1.5 or 2 points on about Wednesday or Thursday, and the line has since moved right in the middle. It's a pick 'em right now, Wes, as we approach kickoff here. And I don't know how much this interests you, Wes, but I suspect that a lot of folks listening have an interest in such matters.
Yeah, and I will say this, that for Gamecock Central subscribers, I'm going to throw a shameless plug in there. Brian Edwards, who is one of the senior handicappers for VegasInsider.com, he has actually returned to do a weekly column on Gamecock Central where he is posting his thoughts on South Carolina from a sort of Vegas and line standpoint, as well as thoughts on a bunch of other games. So, yeah, I think it's easy to get caught up with the most recent games and outcomes and kind of look at these lines and maybe wonder about that. You know, I certainly thought Kentucky was probably going to open as maybe a slight, possibly a field goal favorite, but these Vegas odds makers, they have their reasonings, they have their systems, they have their, I believe, computer systems as well that handle a lot of this stuff. They're generally pretty spot on, and I think as the season goes on, they get even more accurate, it seems. So I thought that was interesting. Now I think you're seeing, I guess both sides sort of swing this thing back and forth as a game that really, it seems like, frankly, could go either way. And, in a game where I think a lot of South Carolina fans are a little bit weary of Kentucky, and in a game that the Kentucky fans seem to be extremely confident about, I think that was actually a pretty good sign for South Carolina fans that Vegas saw this game as being potentially so tight.
Yep, it is a pick'em. The line is even, and the line has moved back and forth. It's moved in both directions this week substantially. I don't mean just a half a point. I mean it's moved a point and a half or more both ways throughout the course of the week. So it was just unusual. You don't see that very often, and I thought that was worth a couple of minutes of discussion here on the Gamecock Central Game Day podcast. Let's go ahead and hear from Collin Taylor. He's our staff writer with Gamecock Central, and he's got South Carolina's keys to victory against Kentucky.
So obviously the key, you heard it all week, but the key is defensively for South Carolina. Stopping Benny Snell is priority number one. If you can get them into a one-dimensional game when they have to pass the ball more than they're typically used to, that's good for South Carolina's defense. And, a lot's been made about South Carolina's run game offensively being the key to victory, and that's obviously going to play a huge part. But I think this game is going to come down to the play of Jake Bentley. It's all he needs to have a breakout game his junior year in a big game, and I think that this is kind of the game he needs to do that in. So I think his play is probably going to be the deciding factor. If he protects the ball and doesn't make mistakes, then I think South Carolina pulls out with the win. So for South Carolina as a team, it's about jumping out to an early lead, not letting Kentucky kind of dictate tempo and the physicality in the run game. And I think if they can do that, they'll pull out with the win. I think it's going to be a fourth quarter game, and I really don't know what to expect. I know it's just going to be tight. Every game they've played the last 5 years has been, so should be a good one, I think.
Thank you, Collin. That's Collin Taylor, staff writer with Gamecock Central. And now for Kentucky keys to victory, we will throw it to Justin Roland from CatsIllustrated.com, our Rivals Network partner.
But number one, I think they have to refocus and have a good week of practice. I thought the most concerning takeaway from what Mark Stoops said at his luncheon with the media was that for the first time he had to poke his team to refocus them. And he sounded surprised. He sounded a little bit disappointed because this is a team that has a lot of leadership in that locker room, starting with somebody like Cash Daniel, an emotional leader at linebacker, with so many seniors on the team. He hasn't had a motivation, a focus problem, and coming off that win against Mississippi State, he seemed like the first day back, they didn't have their heads where they needed to be. And if they're saying that on Wednesday, if they're saying that on Thursday going into Friday, then that's a huge issue because I suspect South Carolina will be very focused. The other issue will be they need to keep the game close. I know they're not thinking in those terms. They want to come out and make a statement early, you'd imagine, but this is not a team that's hardwired to play from behind. They did fall down a touchdown to Mississippi State, but the defense made some great plays to keep that a 7-0 game until they could establish their own game plan. Because they have a great running game and really an unproven passing game, they haven't gotten the receivers involved a whole lot. If they get down 10, 14 points, I think that they could have a hard time playing from behind. So they probably need to keep it within a touchdown in the first couple of quarters.
That's Justin Roland from CatsIllustrated.com. We appreciate him. We appreciate Collin Taylor joining us on the podcast today. Wes, this is going to be fun tonight. Road game, always tough in the Southeastern Conference. Night game, primetime ball game for the Gamecocks and Wildcats.
Yeah, and it really reminds me, and I'm going to take people back a little bit, Emerson. It reminds me of some of those Lou Holtz years where South Carolina had a pretty good football team, and Kentucky had a pretty good football team with Rich Brooks, I believe, as their coach back then. If I'm pegging that right, I hope that I am. But and maybe even back to the days with Hal Mummy. But there were some very, very tight football games between these two schools that had big ramifications for their seasons and that really featured outstanding atmospheres. And then you look getting into the Spurrier era, the quote Eric Norwood game on a Thursday night where Norwood just took over against Kentucky. It was a big time Thursday night atmosphere for South Carolina. Obviously a big win for the Gamecocks there. As much as we don't like to talk about, from a South Carolina perspective, fans don't like to talk about Kentucky being a quote rival in football. these two teams have played some really close, really good, well-contested football games. And I think this is one of those games of, if you're a player, this is why you sign up for college football. For Kentucky, it's about finding a way to get to 5-0 and possibly have a special season. And for South Carolina, it's about going in there and think about the opportunity you have. You have an opportunity to go do exactly what Kentucky's done to you the last few years and spoil something for them. So there's a lot of pressure on the Kentucky Wildcats to go perform tonight, and South Carolina obviously wants to spoil what could be, a truly historic season for those guys.
Yep.
So either way, man, it should be fun.
Yeah, that's should be plenty of incentive for the Gamecocks. And, hey, like it or not, Kentucky is a rival for South Carolina. No doubt about it. SEC East foes getting together tonight. 7:30 kick on the SEC Network. We're just about ready. Wes Mitchell, thank you.
Yes, sir. Let's do it again next week.
We'll do it again next Saturday for the Missouri game. Game Day podcast here on Gamecock Central. For Wes Mitchell, I'm Emerson Phillips. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the ball game.